So I want you to picture this. It's 2004, and Nelson Mandela is standing beside the hospital bed of a pop star.
Yeah, it's a pretty jarring image when you really think about it.
Right. I mean, the man who basically defeated apartheid, this towering global figure of liberation, is paying his deep respects to a woman who, well, her main claim to fame was singing these infectious dance tracks.
Exactly. It's an incredible contrast.
It really is. And it forces you to ask this fundamental question, right?
Yeah.
Like, how does a teenager who started out singing for pocket change on these dusty, segregated street corners eventually engineer the sound of an entire revolution?
Well, to answer that, we're jumping into today's deep dive. We are looking really closely at this extensive MMR column. It's titled Brenda Fassie, Diva of the Township, A Trajectory of Glory and Struggle.
Which is a great title, by the way.
Oh, it's perfect. And this document, it gives us a roadmap of a life that spanned from 1964 to 2004. Because Brenda Fassie, she wasn't just, a musician who happened to live through historical events. Her voice basically became the very architecture of that era's cultural memory.
Yeah, we're jumping right into the deep end today.
Yeah.
I mean, we aren't just reciting a pop star's biography here. We're looking at the literal mechanics of how art and immense personal turmoil and sweeping political shifts all kind of crash into each other.
Right.
Because you really cannot understand the heights this woman reached without deeply understanding the very specific ground she launched from.
And that ground specifically was longer.
Okay, set the stage for us.
Sure. So she was born in November 1964, and she grew up in this township located near Cape Town in South Africa. And, for anyone listening who might be unfamiliar with the urban planning of apartheid-era South Africa, a township wasn't just like a neighborhood or a normal suburb.
No, not at all.
Right. It was a geographic tool of control. It was the physical manifestation of institutional segregation. They were designed with restricted access points, built specifically to keep the Black population economically suppressed and spatially separated from the affluent white urban centers.
It's just a space explicitly built for exclusion. But, I mean, human beings are incredibly resourceful, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because within this incredibly oppressive urban environment, this vibrant, resilient, and totally unique culture thrived anyway. You had this dense network of community, really deep religious roots, and of course, music.
Yes, the music is key here.
Because music in the township wasn't a luxury. It wasn't just background noise you put on while doing dishes. It was a daily utility. It was literally how news traveled, how spirits were lifted, and how people process their reality.
And Fassie was born into a family that was completely embedded in that utility. I mean, she was the youngest of many siblings, so she was always surrounded by noise and activity. Her mother was actually a pianist and a singer.
Oh, wow. So it was in the house from day one.
Ooh, exactly. Which gave her this vital, practical education in music from the time she could literally walk. She sang in local churches, absorbing those really rich choral harmonies of spiritual music, and she also sang to passing tourists on the streets of Langa.
Which is a tough crowd.
Very. But that's where she learned very quickly how to capture and hold the attention of strangers who, honestly, initially had absolutely no interest in her.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I'm struggling with the timeline and the mechanics here.
Sure. What do you mean?
Well, you're telling me a young girl singing on a street corner just suddenly develops the incredibly complex polyrhythmic vocal layering and the linguistic mastery we hear later in her career. I mean, street hustle gives you confidence, sure, and maybe it teaches you how to project your voice, but it doesn't teach you professional multilingual harmonic arrangement.
That is such a good point, and you've hit on a crucial gap in the mythology there, because the streets were really just phase one. They gave her the raw vocal power and that fearlessness. But phase two is rigorous formal practice and really intense collaboration. By the early 1980s, she wasn't relying solely on her childhood hustle anymore.
What was she doing instead?
She actively sought out professional vocal groups. She joined a chorus called Joy, and that is where the actual mechanics of her craft were forged. She learned stagecraft, microphone technique, and to your point, how to weave her voice into complex multi-part harmony.
Ah, okay, that makes so much more sense. She was actively studying the science of performance.
Exactly.
And that linguistic ability she developed, her talent for seamlessly jumping between English, Zulu, and Xhosa within a single verse, that wasn't just some artistic quirk, it was like a demographic skeleton key.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
By singing in multiple languages, she was unlocking 3 different audience bases simultaneously with a single chorus. She was basically building a coalition on the dance floor.
And that coalition building paid off immensely when she became the lead singer of Brenda and the Big Dudes. So, in 1983, they released a track called Weekend Special.
So that's a classic.
It really is. And this is the moment the regional talent becomes a true national phenomenon. The mechanics of this song are just brilliant. It features this infectious shuffle rhythm-like, a beat that perfectly captures the feeling of a Friday night release after a week of grueling labor.
If you listen to the bass line of Weekend Special, it just physically compels you to move. It's got this upbeat, almost bouncy tempo, but the lyrics are incredibly relatable.
Yeah, they really ground the song.
Right. Because she's singing about being treated like a part-time lover, someone only called upon for the weekend. So it's this universal theme of romantic frustration, but it's delivered over an absolutely undeniable groove.
And because of that, it crossed every conceivable boundary. The track just exploded across the country, getting massive airplay. It breached the walls of the townships and infiltrated the national urban radio stations.
Wow.
Suddenly, the marginalized culture that the apartheid government was actively trying to keep hidden away was blasting out of car radios right in the city centers.
I want you listening to just imagine the sheer whiplash of that experience. You are an artist representing a historically ignored, heavily policed community. And seemingly overnight, you are the sound of the moment.
Yeah, it's a massive shift.
You're on the covers of magazines, you're touring. The transition from local church singer to national pop icon is an incredibly steep mountain to climb.
It is. And she reached the summit just as the country was approaching its most volatile and transformative decade. Because throughout the 1980s, Fassie really cemented herself as the representative face of Black pop in South Africa.
She was everywhere.
Her stage shows became legendary. She utilized these elaborate, dazzling costumes and executed really intense aerobic choreography. She just had this uncanny ability to physically command a stadium.
Which brings us to her pivotal 1990 album, Black President. And just to pause here for a second. As guides to this material, we want to remind you that we aren't endorsing any specific political stance. We're strictly reporting the historical facts as outlined in our source.
Right, exactly.
Because purely as a historical artifact, 1990 in South Africa was an undeniable powder keg. The apartheid regime was under massive international and domestic pressure, and Nelson Mandela had been in prison for decades. And right in the middle of this incredibly tense standoff, Brenda Fassie drops a pop album directly addressing the situation.
Yeah, it was incredibly bold. The title track, Black President, was an explicit declaration of anticipation for Mandela's release and eventual leadership. And, keep in mind, at this time, openly supporting Mandela or the African National Congress carried severe, real-world risks.
Yeah, it wasn't just a PR stunt.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Yet she put it right there on the album cover. This wasn't some subtle metaphor. It was a loud, highly visible platform for political expression distributed through mass media.
But how did she do it without just sounding like a dry political rally? I feel like a lot of protest music struggles because it focuses so much on the message that it forgets to be, well, a good song.
That's the genius of it. If we connect this to the bigger picture, she succeeded because she bridged the macro politics with the micro reality.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, take her lyrical approach across that era. She doesn't just sing empty slogans like Free Mandela. She sings about the specific, agonizing reality of a mother waiting for a son who was taken by the police in the middle of the night.
Oh, wow. So she made it personal.
Exactly. She explains how the sweeping laws of apartheid actively destroyed the family dinner table. She sang about the rent, local heartbreak, the daily grind of township life, and she elevated those everyday struggles to the level of national importance. She wasn't just an entertainer, she provided catharsis and acted as a proxy for the community's voice.
She gave them dignity. She took the intimate pain of the township and validated it on a massive national scale. But, functioning as a proxy megaphone for millions of people, that is an unbelievable, crushing amount of human stress.
It's an impossible burden.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we see this tragic star trope a lot in media, right? Where the pressure of fame leads to a crash and people just treat it like an inevitable cliche.
Yeah.
But let's look at the sheer density of what she was carrying on her shoulders.
The timeline of her personal life during this peak is staggering. In 1985, right as her career demands are just skyrocketing, she becomes a mother to her son, Bongani. Then 4 years later, in 1989, she marries Nalala and Bumbo. And this marriage is highly publicized, heavily scrutinized, and ultimately ends in a really difficult divorce. So she's trying to navigate the very normal human experiences of motherhood and heartbreak, all while acting as a political symbol during a literal regime change.
You cannot isolate the artist from that level of historical trauma. The body and the mind can only sustain that kind of output and pressure for so long before something inevitably fractures.
And in the 1990s, those fractures became public. Fassie developed severe substance abuse issues. Specifically, she had a heavily publicized addiction to cocaine.
Yeah, the media was pretty brutal about it.
Relentless. The tabloids continuously documented her struggles, painting her erratic behavior across the front pages. And then in 1995, this profound tragedy occurred. Her partner, Papi Salala, died of an apparent overdose in a hotel room they were sharing.
I mean, the shock of losing the person you love in such a sudden and traumatic way,
Yeah.
that's enough to break anyone. But Fassie wasn't allowed to mourn in private at all, was she?
No, she wasn't. The death sparked a massive media circus. It initiated this grueling cycle of public grief, entering rehabilitation facilities, suffering relapses, and fighting for recovery, all under the flashbulbs of the paparazzi.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It was. However, looking closely at the historical record in the source, this incredibly dark period also inadvertently established her as a major cultural pioneer.
Because she refused to hide the nature of her relationship with Papi.
Exactly. She was a successful Black woman living visibly in a same-sex relationship within a deeply complex, socially conservative landscape. She didn't launch some calculated political campaign for LGBTQ rights. Her mere existence and her refusal to hide her grief forced a level of queer visibility that was almost entirely non-existent in South African mainstream media at the time.
She lived her truth out loud, even when it was messy and agonizing. But, when the public watches a star go through a spiral of addiction, tragic loss, and rehab, the collective assumption is usually that the story is over. They categorize the artist as a casualty of their own fame, just a cautionary tale.
And the music industry is particularly brutal in that regard. By the mid-1990s, a lot of critics and industry insiders had completely written her off. They assumed her era had passed, especially since the musical landscape of South Africa was rapidly changing post-apartheid.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because the human spirit is remarkably stubborn. Between 1996 and 1999, Brenda Fassie doesn't just stage some polite, nostalgic return to the stage. She engineers one of the most dominant, triumphant, artistic resurrections of the decade.
It's incredible.
She completely takes over the charts again.
She really did. She partnered with producer Chico Twala and released a string of absolute powerhouse albums. Now is the Time, Paparazzi, Mameza, and Noma Kanjani.
And those last two are massive.
Oh, Mameza and Noma Kanjani didn't just sell well. They became the defining soundtrack of the late 90s in South Africa. They were multi-platinum behemoths that absolutely shattered sales records.
But you don't achieve that level of dominance just by bringing back your sound from 1983. The culture had shifted, the country was newly democratic, and the youth were listening to different beats. So how exactly did she adapt her music to capture this brand new generation?
She embraced Kwaito.
Okay, for those who don't know, what is Kwaito?
So, to understand the mechanics of Kwaito, imagine classic Chicago house music, but slow the tempo down to this heavy, hypnotic heartbeat. Then you strip back the glossy synths and layer that heavy bass with indigenous African percussion, deep bass lines, enchanted, really rhythmic vocals.
It sounds amazing.
It's phenomenal. It was the sound of a newly liberated South Africa exhaling. It was music made for celebration, for the clubs, and for the streets.
And the source points out that the ultimate synthesis of her incredible vocals in this new Kwaito beat is the track Vuli Ndlela, which translates roughly to clear the path or open the way.
Right. And Vuli Ndlela is just a masterpiece of cultural fusion. It takes the traditional communal feeling of a South African wedding song, the celebratory lyrics, the call and response structure, and marries it perfectly to that driving slow house Kwaito beat.
I can imagine how big that was.
When that song dropped in a club or at a party, it was an absolute reset. It commanded everyone to the floor.
But it wasn't just the production that had changed. Because if you listen to her voice on Mameza, the physical instrument of her vocal cords had actually evolved.
Definitely. The sheer mileage of her life was audible in her singing. Her voice had settled into this thick, really resonant mid-range. She retained the raw, almost aggressive power of her youth, but it was now edged with this raspy texture that conveyed deep emotional weight.
You can really hear it.
You hear it on the dance tracks, absolutely, but it is just devastatingly apparent on her ballads, like the track Too Late for Mama.
Oh, Too Late for Mama is a masterclass in emotional delivery. The lyricism focuses on the tragedy of a mother discovering her child's death. And when Fassie hits the crescendo of that song, you aren't just hearing a pop singer hit a note. You are hearing a woman who has survived unimaginable personal and communal grief, channeling all of it into a single microphone.
She had successfully reclaimed her crown. I mean, she was dominating the airwaves again, touring internationally, winning awards. She proved every single critic wrong.
She totally did. She reclaimed her crown, dominating the clubs and the charts. But, the human body can only sustain that level of intense output and that much historical trauma for so long.
Yeah, unfortunately.
By 2004, the decades of relentless performing, the private struggles, and just the sheer physical exhaustion had taken their toll.
They had. In late April of 2004, Fassie collapsed at her home in Johannesburg. She was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. And really, the entire nation held its breath.
Which brings us back to where we started.
Exactly. High-profile figures, including Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, visited her bedside. But despite days of intensive medical intervention, she passed away on May 9th, 2004. She was only 39 years old.
It's so young. And while the tabloids obviously ran wild with sensationalized rumors of an illicit drug relapse, the medical reality reported at the time was less scandalous but equally tragic. The source notes it was a severe asthma attack that ultimately brought on cardiopulmonary failure.
Right. It was a devastating, abrupt conclusion to a life lived at 1,000 miles an hour.
Yet the legacy she left behind is almost immeasurable in its scale. I mean, she took the authentic, unfiltered voice of the Black Township, a voice actively suppressed by the state for decades, and pushed it to the absolute center of global pop culture. She basically dismantled the barriers for future generations of Black female artists across the entire African continent.
And that legacy isn't just some dusty memory. It's an active, living force in the music industry today.
For sure.
Her musical disciples carry her DNA forward. Her son, Bongani, became a successful musician and producer in his own right. She deeply influenced international artists and even collaborated with heavyweights like the Congolese rumba star Papa Wemba. And through posthumous greatest hits and retrospectives, her status really transitioned from a contemporary pop star to a foundational historical icon.
Think about the raw, undeniable power of authentic art for a second. A young girl singing to tourists in Langa eventually creates the anthems that a newly liberated nation uses to heal, to dance, and to define its own freedom. She sang her way from the absolute margins of society to the very center of its heart.
It is the ultimate testament to the fact that you can geographically segregate a people, but you cannot suppress their cultural brilliance.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to consider long after this deep dive ends. We rightfully celebrate the art, and we marvel at the resilience of icons like Brenda Fassie. But when an artist uses their own profound personal pain and their messy, agonizingly public struggles to create the very anthems that heal and unite a nation, what is the true hidden cost of that music? And the next time you hear a massive culture-shifting song that moves a whole generation, ask yourself, what did that artist have to survive just to sing those notes for you?